Okay, welcome back to Plato's Cave. With me, I have Adam Kadlac. He is a professor of philosophy at Wake Forest and the author of an upcoming book, The Ethics of Sports Fandom, which we're talking about a chapter of that today. So, Adam, thanks for joining me.
Really great to be here.
So, I wanted to say it's very brave of you to come on here with a Pitt fan after what we did to Wake Forest in the ACC championship.
Yeah, so that didn't go how most Wake people sort of hoped. It was a good season for the Deacs, though. I occupy this sort of strange place with respect to Wake Forest athletics. On the one hand, I support them, students in my class, and so on. But as a graduate of the University of Wisconsin, all of my strong loyalties run that way. I'm more of a parental kind of observer of students when they're that I know when they're on the field. So I was obviously just disappointed for the students that I happen to know, but I didn't experience the pain quite as a fan in the same way that I did when Wisconsin lost to Minnesota.
Yeah, definitely. No, they had a good season, and I'm sure the pain wasn't nearly as bad as what kicking it on fourth down last year, the Packers.
The Packers. Yes. Yeah. It's funny. I have one of the things that comes out in the book is that I have a lot of loyalties. I have a lot of different teams, and there's always the next game. And so the pain lingers a bit, but Packers are having a really good season, and that seems like a long time ago. There are occasional losses that you can bring up and they still really sting.
Yeah.
Wisconsin's loss in the basketball title game to Duke a few years ago still hurts when you talk about that. Honestly, the Packers lost to the Broncos in the Super Bowl back in what was that, 98?
Yeah.
I was still in college at the time. That one still hurts. The Packers were the better team. But, again, you move on to the next game.
Yeah, definitely. So like I said, we're talking about, you were kind enough to send me two chapters, but I really want to focus on the fourth one, which is titled Avoiding the Pitfalls of Objectification. And so this book it has a publication date of 2022, and it's available for pre-order in a couple of days, right?
And it's already shipped. I know people who have it in their hands, although
okay.
I am not one of them yet. I haven't received my hard copies, but I know people. I have a friend in Germany who emailed me last week and said he had gotten his copy. A friend from high school screenshotted him holding the book, so it's out. You can order it from Rutledge, or I don't know if Amazon has shipped their copies yet, but you can get it now. So it's on its way out, and I'm hoping to see it soon.
Yeah, nice. That's that's kind of surprising that the author doesn't have his copies first.
I have theories about when that happened. If I don't have them soon, I'll email somebody and see what's going on.
Yeah. Well, I can say to anyone listening, the number one crime you don't commit, at least in the chapters that I read, is ruining sports. There was a real risk of, I could totally see someone else just butchering this with overly conceptually analyzing things and necessary and sufficient conditions for every little thing, and just taking the fun out of it. But you don't do that. So.
Well, that's good. That certainly wasn't my goal. Although I did decide that if all I was going to say was everything fans do all the time is fine, then that probably wasn't going to be a very interesting book. So there are some revisionary contentions in the book, and I do sort of, even with my own fandom, have thought as I've been working on the project about some things that I should approach differently or think about differently, and so on. But yeah, it certainly wasn't my goal to ruin sports for anybody. And it was at the end of the day to try to argue for the appropriate good place that being a sports fan can occupy in our lives. And so, yeah, the killing the joy of sports was not the goal, but putting it in a different sort of perspective and thinking about how we can think about sports better certainly was the goal.
Yeah. Actually, in this chapter that I read of yours, you made me realize I think there are at least two things that I made a note of. in the margins that I was doing that I actually didn't even realize that I was doing. So it's a good kind of introspection as a sports fan. You know, I'm a big Steelers fan. So this is not our year, obviously, but so the chapter is all about objectification. And the reason why I was interested in this is because I've been really getting into, you know, P.F. Strawson's Freedom and Resentment, where he defines the reactive and the objective attitudes, and then all of the subsequent work about that. And you cite kind of maybe the main citation that the chapter builds off of is this really popular paper by Martha Nussbaum in 1995, just titled Objectification, which I actually haven't read, but the excerpts that you give, I'm definitely going to read it now. So she gives these kind of seven that you kind of introduce the chapter with, seven aspects. Nussbaum doesn't think they're necessary and sufficient, right? But they're seven aspects of objectification. And so maybe I could just read through them and then we can talk about them.
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, cool. So there's instrumentality, which is where one treats another as a tool of one's own purposes. There's denial of autonomy, where one treats another as lacking in autonomy and self-determination. There's inertness, which is where you treat someone as lacking agency and activity. Fungibility, where someone is interchangeable with another thing or person of the same type and with various things of other types. There's volubility, which is where one treats another as lacking in boundary integrity and as something that is permissible to break up or smash or break into pieces. Ownership, where someone treats another as something that is to be owned or bought and sold, traded, etc. And seventh is denial of subjectivity, which is where one treats another as something whose experience and feelings, if any, need not be taken into account. So these are super interesting. And the one that really jumped out to me at first was ownership. You know, we even call there are team owners and players are really bought and sold as a commodity.
Yeah. So one of the things that was challenging about working on the project is that you touch on all these other debates. You wade into all these other debates, of which you are not a central participant. And so I was constantly worried, and to this day, I'm worried about wading into territory where I'm kind of out of my depth and where people who are steeped in the debate are going to say, yeah, well, but this, I decided at a certain point that was just a risk of the kind of project that I was going to try to do, because what I really wanted to do was draw on all these things to help us understand fandom better. My interest in objectification, actually, the overall project started out just focused on football. I was going to try to do basically a book about contemporary moral problems in the current state of American football, and in ways that are no longer reconstructible. I can no longer reconstruct in my head. I kind of waded into this idea of objectification because there's this distance that fans have from what's going on the field, where we can forget quite easily that it's human beings who are playing the games, right? And we can think of them just as athletes, just as bodies performing, which is kind of the language that I start to use later in the chapter. And the parallels with pornography ended up being kind of obvious to me, just as a way, as a lens, ethical lens to think about what's going on. And I don't make a claim in the paper about the ethical permissibility or not of pornography, but the language on objectification in the literature on pornography, I think, sheds interesting light on sort of how we engage with athletes and how we view them as property. And it's really striking. I had a conversation with a friend a few years ago about the NFL Combine, and if you ever watch footage of the Combine, it's, guys essentially in their underwear doing all sorts of athletic things, and they take all these measurements, and they, they're like poked and prodded, and they're measured, and they take all these statistics and so on. And particularly in a context where so many of the athletes are Black, you get a really disconcerting echo of slavery and treating bodies as property solely in terms of what they're able to do. And rather than remembering that body belongs to or is a human being, is a person that is not reducible to what they're able to do on the field. And as fans, I've certainly done this plenty, right? Where you think about the player you're angry at. It's almost always when you're upset with them. Or dissatisfied that they didn't make the play or whatever it happens to be, that you forget there's a person behind in football. Particularly, maybe it's easier because they're wearing helmets and you don't see their faces as much, but you forget that it's a person there. And in terms of the language of buying, selling, trading players as commodities is sort of shot through the sports industrial complex. Now that's not always bad. I mean, the way in which contracts are arranged and your teams are trying to improve themselves and they're trying to get better players. I mean, part of that's just business. But I think remembering that it's a business that involves human beings, not just bodies, is important.
Yeah, that was the thing that really kind of it really struck me as I was reading this, is for a lot of these things, there's almost no other way in which they could happen, but the degree to which we do objectify them is something that could be attenuated while still not losing. I mean, like you said, sports have to acquire and trade and do all these things with players, and that's just going to be part of the game. But it's almost, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I take it you're kind of making a degree argument here. It's like, whoa, we're a little too, in some cases, little too easily objectifying and too objectifying in its totality towards people.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Yes, I think that's fair. I think there's also the questions about, and I touch on this later in the chapter, the way we view athletes when they're not on the field, right? And what we expect of them when they're not on the field. And I try to draw the connection to the sort of view that a lot of people seem to have, that athletes should just stick to sports, and that their views on social questions and moral questions just shouldn't be, I mean, they don't have standing to speak, and why, you get paid to play. What you have to say about these political issues shouldn't matter. And so I think that that's a way in which, thinking and remembering that none of us want to be treated that way, whatever our line of work, right? I mean, I teach classes and produce philosophical research that I hope is interesting, but that's not all I am. I do all sorts. I mean, I'm interested in sports. I have a family. I have a vibrant life outside of the way in which a lot of people relate to me, and denying people that extension of their humanity and saying, no, look, this is what you are. This is your only worth. I think is really problematic too. So there's the way in which you think about what's going on when it's on the field. And I think the biggest way in which trying to de-objectify players has affected me in that regard is just remembering that they're people, that they're trying. In almost every case, they're trying. And they may or may not be successful, but they're people. And that's actually made me more sympathetic to athletes, just in general. I feel bad for the athletes when they're on my team and they don't win, my favorite teams, and they don't win. And you feel happier for them when they're successful and so on, but also to remember that they're not just what they are on the field.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned, helmets and pads in football specifically kind of obscuring the humanity of people, but I saw this now. I mean, we even identify them by numbers, it's like, we're serializing them too. So that's interesting. And yet what you said, I had a note, it kind of struck me that a lot of this chapter is pointing out some of the costs while not denying a lot of the benefits that athletes, have in their job. Right. And this is a job. And it kind of made me think, wow, a lot of and maybe philosophy isn't quite the best example of this, but just if you have some office job, it has a lot of these same costs, these same ways in which employees are objectified, with a fraction of the benefits to a professional athlete.
Yeah, absolutely. this analysis can extend to all sorts of different areas. I think what makes it particularly relevant in sports, and I touch on this in the chapter, is that I think the fact that there are such benefits, particularly financial benefits for at least the top level players, obscures the fact that they can still be objectified. It makes it easier for us to sort of explain away the objectifying aspects of their job, and to think, well, look, you get paid to play, you get paid a whole lot of money to play, and therefore people might more easily slide into the conclusion that, well, you can't be objectified in that way. I think there's also this aspirational feature where, most boys that I knew growing up at some point in their lives wanted to be a professional athlete of some sort. We grow up projecting ourselves into what's going on on the field. And so when some part of it, most people give that up at some point. And for me, I gave it up long time ago. But there's some part of the back of your mind that still thinks, oh, how cool would it be to, catch the winning touchdown in a Super Bowl? And that also can make us think that, can make us immune isn't the right word, blind to the fact that we can also objectify these same athletes that we seem to admire. I think a similar dynamic comes up every time there's some labor negotiation. What the Major League Baseball is locked out right now, and you people frame it in terms of millionaires and billionaires arguing about how many zeros are going to be on their checks, and there's a way in which that's, I think, partially fair for a lot of people who are just struggling to get by. But I think it's also the case, not to be too Marxian about it, but it's also a case of labor and capital, and the fact that so much money is at stake can lead us to forget that, oh wait, Aaron Rodgers is an employee, and in fact he's a union employee, and when that kind of status comes into view, he's a very, 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 very well compensated union employee. But in terms of the power structure of sports, I think it's, again, something that's easy to forget.
Although this offseason, I don't think anyone forgot how much of an employee Rodgers was. That was his main.
No, that's absolutely. But that's, in some ways, this is especially as a lifelong Green Bay Packers fan who absolutely loves watching Aaron Rodgers play football. It's just stunning, I think, what he's able to do. It's a good reminder, a good test of the kind of arguments I made in the chapter, where he's doing things. Well, there's two aspects to this. One is in his labor negotiations and deciding whether or not he's going to come back. As a Packers fan who wants them to win, I want him to come back. But it turns out it's not my life. And fans have a tendency, I think, to hold athletes to standards in their commitments to their jobs that they don't hold themselves to, or maybe all sorts of other people in their lives. People change jobs all the time when they think they can have a better employment situation, whether it's financial or whatever other reason that we want to move to another job. And yet we expect players to have the same commitment to the teams that we love that we have. I have a colleague in the philosophy department who still cannot stand Carlton Fisk because he left the Red Sox for the White Sox back in this is the 70s.
Wow.
But and we've had this conversation. My point is, well, he got a different job, right? He wanted to work somewhere else.
Yeah.
And I think the commitment that the players have. So that was a good reminder, a good test case for me to be like, well, if he wants to play somewhere else, it's, I'll be sad in a sense that I don't get to watch him play as a fan of the team that I support. But it's his job. Then there was all the vaccine stuff a few weeks ago, the COVID stuff, when it tests when he's now saying things with which I personally disagree. And I think he's made a bad personal decision and a bad ethical decision in some way. What are the limits of the objectification? What leeway do we give athletes to speak when they're saying things that we don't agree with. If I'm going to say, well, we shouldn't silence athletes like Colin Kaepernick who are standing up for causes that I support, are we more licensed to silence them and say, well, shut up and, stick to sports when they say things that we don't agree with? That was another kind of good test of the theory, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that was an excellent test. I wonder, you just made me think of this now. So, when we're kind of voting on or analyzing people for the MVP, right? And Rodgers is leading that conversation right now. There's an interesting way in which it's almost more fair to quasi-objectify people. So I'm sure there are people making the argument that, look, Rodgers shouldn't be a candidate for MVP because he deceived like the league and the league officials and violated protocol because you're supposed to wear a mask at press conferences and he didn't because So there's a way in which, and I wonder if this just depends on the standards by which you evaluate an MVP candidate. Does it include off the field antics or not? But I could see someone kind of going, okay, Adam, fine, but what about this scenario in which it's actually more fair to objectify people in a sense and only look at their on-field performance when evaluating them for MVP?
Yeah, that's a really good case study. I confess that I'm one of these people that individual awards in team sports, I don't know what to do with. And I personally don't really care about. But we had the same, so that's not to dismiss the question. It's just to state my own personal view that I don't know what to do with this sort of stuff. And then there's been the same sort of conversation most of my life about Pete Rose and the Baseball Hall of Fame, who, by any objective measure of what he did on the field is a all-time great player. And yet he's not in there because of stuff that he did off the field. I think, so I think it would be really hard to give someone the MVP who, you can run just ridiculous thought experiments, right? Like, suppose you found out right after the season was over that they were engaged in some, I don't know, just really horrific.
Just something crazy, yeah.
Just something, yeah. You can fill in the blank. Are there cases where that maybe should remove them from contention for the MVP? Probably. Probably.
Like aesthetically, yes.
But where do you, again, maybe this is getting back to the point that it's an argument about degree. Where do you sort of draw that line? And I don't know the answer to that. Do I think that Rodgers' transgressions, such as they've been, are egregious enough to mean that it's just totally illegitimate to vote for him for MVP? No. Yeah. I also, again, I'm on record saying, look, that whatever MVP, MVP doesn't.
Yeah.
What matters is what they're able to do as a team on the field, in my view. But that's just my own quirky thing. I think the Rose case is maybe a little different, and this is the argument that people have made for a long time: is that his transgression went to gambling on baseball, went to the integrity of the sport, and it wasn't necessarily the degree to which he did something bad. It was the particular sort of bad thing that he did. And I've actually generally found that argument sort of convincing, in the sense that if you do something that goes to the integrity of what's happening on the field, the very thing for which you are being honored, that does strike me as at least potentially different.
Yeah.
Than, for example, had Rose, I don't know, robbed a liquor store or something.
Something totally unrelated.
Totally unrelated. Yeah.
I almost wonder if there's also a difference between whether they commit the act that is potentially barring them from whatever it is, the Hall of Fame or the MVP, after the award has been given, as opposed to before. So you could totally, like, it's not even conceivable. Pretend you think that Rodgers bending the truth at best about his immunization status, or vaccination status, because that was the word he used.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. So let's say you
See,
think
he
that
got
he did actually. Yeah. Well, because the point there is that in most people's minds, they are interchangeable, so,
Right.
so
Right.
saying,
Exactly.
yeah. So let's say that you're someone who thinks that should be something that wipes out his MVP status. I think it's inconceivable that you would say that he should be stripped of last year's MVP, right? Like that doesn't even seem in the realm of possibility.
I think that's probably, I think that's probably right.
Yeah.
But I mean, would you even strip him of that MVP if he, I don't know, committed some heinous murder in the off season?
No.
I mean,
I get the intuition. No.
Yeah. I'm not sure. I think
Yeah.
again, the interesting ethical questions for me around the Rodgers case this year are, was he treated equally to other people who committed similar infractions? It's not clear that he was actually. Like he was given a little bit of a pass, maybe in terms of what his sanctions should have been.
Yeah.
And that seems bad to me. I had a op-ed kind of rolling around about that whole thing. There was a lot of sanctimony even among Packers fans. I had some people in my social network circles that were saying, look, I would rather, lose every game now than win with Rodgers at the helm. And I said, first of all,
easy.
give it 2 weeks and you're going to feel very differently, I suspect.
Yeah.
Moreover, and more importantly, there is this dynamic about, we're already supporting teams that have people on them that believe very crazy things and do ethically questionable things. Rodgers just got caught, and B is one of the most famous athletes in the world. So, the moralization of this is something I actually talk about in the previous chapter about partisan fandom. The moralization of our sporting attachments, I think, is something that is generally probably best left aside, at least in terms of justifying our own attachments to ourselves. I think, and I don't know, I have to revisit with some of these people that made this claim. If the Packers go on to win the Super Bowl, like, are they posting on Facebook how happy they are? Or am I going to hold them and say, you know what, you said you'd rather lose every game. You'd rather the Packers lose every game for the rest of the season than win with Rodgers at the helm. Did you really mean that?
Yeah. Did you celebrate when they won? Or that would be a good kind of a hypocrisy test.
Yeah.
So this was what you kind of said. So one of the questions that I wanted to get into you with, and I kind of have mixed feelings about, is to what degree, I guess there's two questions I'd like to explore. First one is, to what degree objectification is the problem, as opposed to maybe the expression of ethically questionable reactive attitudes of blame, anger, indignation, resentment, something like that, right? And then the second question is how we define, or kind of what constitutes objectification. So to the first question, and you kind of, it was funny. I actually was, I printed out the proof you sent me, and I was writing notes in the margins. And I love when this happens when I'm reading, but I would write a question, we're like, I don't know what I think about this. And then the next paragraph would be you addressing that question. So it was perfect.
It happens sometimes.
Yeah. So one of the questions that this happened with is, because I kind of wrote in a margin, I wonder, like, to what extent are a lot of these problems actually due to my not really objectifying fans in the sense of dehumanizing them. But I wonder, in what sense is this an issue of me treating these people kind of as if I would react to someone who had wronged me in a way that these players obviously haven't.
Yeah. So I don't intend objectification to be an exhaustive analysis of all the problems that can go wrong in fandom by any stretch. It is, I think, a particular, the effort was just to do something which isn't my usual mode of doing philosophy, which is to take one lens and that's usually directed at one thing and directed at something else and see what shows up. And I ended up thinking it's a fairly fruitful lens to think about at least some of the things that can go wrong in the relationship between fans and players. I absolutely also think that this notion that fans are somehow wronged when things don't go right on the field, or that players owe something in particular to fans. And I wrestle a little bit with what actually do players owe fans. My inclination is to say not very much, but we can get back to that. But I absolutely think that this sense that, you know, we are wronged as fans when things don't go the way we want them to. For example, that Rodgers was wronging, if he goes to another team, that he's somehow wronging the Green Bay Packers fan base in the sense that they owe, you know, he owes us his undying, you know, loyalty. or that coaches, I mean, you know, coaches make decisions that we don't like all the time, or that we disagree with all the time. Have they wronged us by, you know, going for a field goal instead of not, when we, even if it's the wrong decision, even if in sort of some strategic sense on the field, it's the wrong decision. Have they wronged me as a fan by depriving me of what? I mean, what am I entitled? I'm certainly not entitled to
a win,
having having the teams I support win championships. No one's entitled to that. So in what sense have I been wronged? And I absolutely think that fans do feel aggrieved in that way. We sometimes do feel entitled to those sorts of things. And yeah, maybe the lens of the reactive attitudes would be another kind of fruitful lens for thinking about. You know, it's not one that I talk about in the book at all, but it certainly strikes me as another lens that could be fruitful in thinking about, well, how are some of the ways in which this relationship can kind of go awry. So yeah, I'm absolutely, that's really interesting. Again, not something specifically that I've thought of in those terms, but it strikes me as plausible. I do talk at various points throughout the book about this question of, you know, what do players owe fans? I think a lot of this is layered on top of the identification that fans have with their team. So the first chapter in the book is entitled On We, not the emotion, but on we, and the way in which fans invoke first person plural when they're talking about their teams, and this strong identification that we have that what happens on the field happens to us in some way, is something that probably feeds this sense that we've been wronged. There's just such a strong identification with the teams we support. And that's something that I think is better held at arm's length. That's sort of the burden of that chapter is to suggest that sort of a strong identification is probably better left aside. But yeah, so I'm a pluralist about the frameworks that we can use to kind of get at what's going on here. And I like that notion of the reactive attitudes is really interesting.
Yeah, I was thinking about the kind of reactive attitudes in being a fan of a team. And like this year, the Steelers are a perfect example of that, where they've just, I mean, it's been brutal being a Steelers fan this year. And one thing that is maybe it's a bit of an attenuation, a bit of a door is I don't remember the quote that you give, but you say that there can be this kind of ironic sense that you're blaming people or getting really angry at people. And I find that to be true, where, I have one of my oldest friends and I are like, huge Steelers fans. And, sometimes we'll be talking like, while we're both watching the game or after the game or whatever, and we'll just be indignant at some call that Tomlin made, whereas he decided to punt, and we're like, what are you doing? And there's just like the full, like the gates of the reactive attitudes open. But at the end of the day, it's like, yeah, all of those are a little bit ironic, where he's the coach. I'm obviously not going to do as good a job as he would, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I think the example I use is when we hate talk about how much we hate players. And I think the example I know I use this example at some point is Randy Moss.
Yeah.
Back when he played for the Vikings, he murdered the Packers every time they would play, and he has a certain brashness about him that made him easy to hate, quote unquote, as an opposing player. Well, I'm trying to think right now. I sort of try to resist that language. I mean, I talk freely about teams that I hate, the Vikings being one of them. But do I really? Well, maybe it's easier to hate teams legitimately, but players. I mean, and even back then, did I really hate Randy Moss? No. Yeah. And I would have taken him on the Packers of course. I mean, yeah. Favre throwing, that was back in the Favre era. Favre throwing to Moss would have been lethal. Just absolutely lethal. And so I would have taken him on the team in 2 seconds. And actually in his post playing career, I actually enjoy listening. I mean, I can't remember if he works for ESPN now or what he did for a while. He's sort of interesting to listen to, a fun guy to hear talk. So yeah, this kind of ironic distance that we hold our emotions or our feelings about particular players. I'm not sure. I mean, one of the things that I hope results, if people are convinced by the book and internalize its arguments, is for all of us to hold some of our emotions at a little bit more of a distance. I don't know if it's an ironic distance, but at a little bit more of a distance, to put them in a slightly different perspective. Remembering, and you might make the argument, well, it's just sports, it doesn't really matter. And that's actually something I try to distance myself from. I don't want to trivialize sports. I think if anything is important, sports probably are in some way, shape, or form. But I think keeping in mind that what happens on the field it's this identification thing, right? Isn't really something that happens to us as fans, at least in the same way as it happens to the players. And so, I still get emotional during, I go happy, upset. Certain losses are harder to shake off than others, but trying to keep our emotions in a certain kind of perspective, I think, is one of the burdens of the book.
Yeah. So I want to circle back to the second kind of question that I have mixed feelings about, and that is what constitutes objectification. Because you lay out Nussbaum's 7 aspects of objectification, and then you kind of juxtapose it, or you add some commentary by other writers. And I'm not familiar with this author, but you kind of juxtapose Nussbaum with a critic of hers, Papadaki. Am I pronouncing that right?
I think so.
Okay. So Papadaki says that these examples that Nussbaum gives aren't really objectification, and Nussbaum goes on to spin a lot of these as they can be innocuous or positive forms of objectification. Right. And I think sex is the kind of examples that she uses, right? Like there's a way in which she argues you could permissibly objectify someone sexually, or
even on Nussbaum's view, desirably objectify someone.
Yeah,
it could even be, in certain contexts, it could even be a desirable or a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So Papadaki, you have this quote from her. She says, "We treat objects as not having any autonomy or subjectivity whatsoever. We do not treat objects as lacking in autonomy and subjectivity the one moment and then go on to treating them as autonomous subjects the rest of the time. It would be insane for me to do that with a chair, for instance."
Right.
But she continues, "Furthermore, since objects clearly do not have humanity, we do not at any time acknowledge, respect, or try to promote their humanity. Doing so would be absurd, even problematic." So I'm wondering if instead of trying to collapse the concept of objectification as strongly as she is, I wonder if she could just say that it seems like there's an obvious difference between non-conscious objects versus objectification of conscious objects, which it was kind of odd. I don't know, maybe I'm not understanding the debate there, but I found it odd that she criticized Nussbaum in that way, because when when I objectify someone, and maybe I'm kind of viewing this too much through like the Straussonian terms, it seems like I do kind of degrade someone's status as an agent to an object and view them closer to the way I would view a chair than the way in which I would view someone in just, normal agentic interactions.
Yeah. So I think two points on the debate there. First, I don't think that Papadaki thinks that you can't slide back and forth between.
Okay.
I don't think she thinks that. Yeah, that you can't slide back and forth between objectifying attitudes and non-objectifying attitudes. I think the idea is, and maybe this is a Straussonian point, that in general, the possibility of, how do I put this, that the possibility of being objectified means that you already occupy a certain conceptual space, right? So you can't actually objectify a chair, because it can't occupy a non-objectifying space. If that, I think that's the idea. And so the possibility of objectification means, I think, that you're already in the space where certain kinds of reactive attitudes, or, I mean, to put it in those terms, are appropriate. I think, and this is the lens or the way in which I tried to do the exposition, I think the crux of the debate between Papadaki and Nussbaum is really on this question of whether it's possible to objectify someone willingly, whether or to put it differently, whether objectification can be a good thing.
Yeah.
And I note in that chapter that at a certain point, we're getting into really fine-grained verbal disputes about, well, how are we using or deploying the word objectification? I'm more sympathetic to the idea that, well, look, if I want you to treat me in a certain way as an object, then that by itself means that you're not treating me as an object, right? I mean, I'm expressing to you my desire, my consent, my choice, all of those things. And hence, even if you're quote unquote treating me as an object, I'm not being objectified because I'm being given a voice in the process. Langton's, so I also talk about Ray Langton's work on objectification. I think she's pretty insightful on this particular point. In her book, Sexual Solipsism, she talks about a lot of these different issues. And she actually, so drawing the parallel between sports and pornography, she makes the point that a lot of what is promoted in pornography is the idea that the people involved are doing this willingly and desiringly and with their consent, and that they want to be treated in the ways that they're being treated. That's, even though if it might appear they're being treated as objects, what's lying in the background is the assumption that this is how they want to be treated. Now, whether that's true of the porn industry more generally or all instances, and she thinks it's not true, that's the same kind of conceptual, I don't know the exact word I'm looking for, different conceptual spaces, I think, that allow it to do its work.
Yeah. Okay. So Langton, I had this highlight from her. So this is you summarizing her. It's problematic because the objectifier focuses on the bodies of others to the exclusion of their subjectivity. So I was wondering if that assumes a mismatch or a disconnect between the way their body would be treated and how they would desire for it to be treated. If we were going on your kind of threshold account, where if you ask me to objectify you in some way and I do it, I'm not in a deep sense objectifying you because you've already kind of consented to it.
Yeah, I think that's basically
okay.
That's basically what I think. And hence, but precisely because I want you to do it, you can't, right? You're not objectifying me. I mean, I think so at a certain point, look, I think the objectifying attitude or stance or view or approach is something we can do that makes no external difference to the outside world in terms of how we behave.
Yeah.
I think that's possible.
Yeah, totally.
So I think I think it's possible to just go around objectifying people and no one is the wiser. No one knows anything, right?
Yeah.
Because it doesn't manifest itself in any change in our behavior. So it is really an outlook. It is really a view, a question about how we are viewing someone that I think's at issue. And then, there's an interesting question about whether that's wrong intrinsically. It's really hard. It's really hard, I think, I'm inclined to think it is actually, but it's hard to explain why. Except that it's a false view. People aren't objects. The case I try to make in the chapter is that there's at least some potential for trickle-down effects of an objectifying attitude. And this is something that case is made explicitly in some anti-pornography literature, that the tendency to objectify women in pornography leads to the tendency to objectify women more generally. And that can have trickle-down effects in terms of how women are treated. I think it's possible in the same way in sports. And the example I give, as someone who spent a lot of time in the youth sports industrial complex, is that you see how this trickles down to youth sports, pretty clearly when you hear all the insane things that happen on the sidelines, where you forget that not only are they people too on, the U12 soccer field, but they're kids.
But they're U12.
Right? Yeah. But I mean, the way in which the tendency to impose the mindset we have when we're watching a game on television, where it's professionals, highly paid professionals playing, to translate that to different contexts is, at least, I think, potentially a problem. It's obviously an empirical question whether this is actually how it plays out. But I think I have decent anecdotal evidence that it does in at least some cases. And whether or not trying to avoid the pitfalls of objectification, as I labeled the chapter, in our fandom, in our more general fandom, will prevent that in other problematic contexts. I'm not sure. It's definitely changed the way. I like to think that I've always had youth sports in pretty decent perspective, at least avoiding the worst versions of insanity. But it's changed my view even more as I've sort of thought about the ways in which, well, look, it's not just that, like, all athletes are people.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Anyway.
What's interesting? So if we're kind of looking at professional sports through that threshold look of objectification, I guess, so the kind of the grounding of why you find reasonable problems with the way professional sports are viewed by fans is not, well, maybe, so I don't know. So there's a question of, are the problems intrinsically due to objectification of professional athletes, or is it that in consenting to be objectified, signing the sports contract to play on a team, we are not as I'm blanking on her name, as Langdon puts it, we're not treating their bodies in objectifying, sports athletes in a way that they would consent to. So is it objectification qua objectification, or is it objectification qua the way we treat them after we objectify them, for you?
I mean, I think for Langton's bit, and I think that her addition to Nussbaum's list, where she talks about silencing, is really important, is a really important piece of the puzzle, because I don't think that athletes consent to being silenced.
Yeah.
And this connects to the issues of, sticking to sports and speaking out on issues and having lives off the field. I don't think that they are, whatever their whatever they're agreeing to subject their bodies to in the service of doing their jobs on the field, I don't think they're consenting to be silenced.
To being
off
silenced,
it.
yeah.
And so I think that's a really, again, this was initially the main lens through which I was thinking about ethical problems in football having to do with concussions and bodies and injuries and all that sort of stuff. And I still think it's useful in thinking about that, but it really kind of came out more forcefully with Colin Kaepernick and, athlete protests, and how we're to think about athlete protests. And if you want to say, well, look, you signed the contract, you agreed to play, I think that's fair, right? I mean, that's their job. Where it's interesting whether it's college athletes' jobs or not, but that's your job. But that doesn't mean that you agreed to, not say anything about anything else ever.
Yeah.
And so I think that, the connection between athletes who want to talk about things other than sports is why there's at least some light that specifically the notion of objectification can shed on that particular issue.
Yeah. Oh, we should end on the silencing question, but before we get that, I just want to close the loop on the objectification stuff. Because so what you said clarified things for me, and I think I understand where I kind of fit with respect to you in the book and Papadaki and Nussbaum. The one thing that I thought was I did strongly disagree with. So you in summarizing Papadaki say, so on her view, the idea that objectification could occur in a context where the autonomy and subjectivity of another is deeply respected is contradictory. So she's saying if one's autonomy and subjectivity are being respected, then one's not being objectified, no matter what things might look like to an external observer. And I just thought that seemed very wrong in the way that you could objectify another and precisely take into account their feelings and desires and intentions as kind of variables. Strawson has the language of manipulation, something to be accounted for, right? And it strikes me that I could do that in a positive and a negative way with respect to someone. So if I was trying to manipulate you into doing something, a crucial aspect of me doing that is going to be me taking into account your desires, in kind of motivating you to either do the things that I want or not. And I could be in a beneficent way towards you or a very pejoratively manipulative way.
Yeah, I think that's certainly true. I'm just not inclined to see those as instances of objectification.
Okay, interesting.
Right.
Yeah.
So
because of your threshold view.
Well, I also so take certain forms of like just incredible cruelty, anecdotes from Nazi concentration camps of how Nazi guards treated Jewish prisoners. Mm-hmm. There's an inclination to say that, well, they objectified them. They treated them as, lacking subjectivity. They were just objects. But I think a far more plausible analysis is actually, no, they very much took subjectivity into account. They just didn't, they used it in a particular way.
Yeah.
Or I don't know, a recent example, I don't know if you've seen or read the Underground Railroad, Colson Whitehead's novel, or it's an Amazon series looking at slaveholding in the American South. And it's very clear that the distinctive forms of cruelty as portrayed, it's a fictionalized narrative that has a kind of fantastic, in a sense of fantasy layer over it. But the core elements of a lot of the encounters are deeply rooted in, historical facts. A lot of the distinctive cruelty that slave owners exercised on enslaved people precisely took account of their subjectivity. And so the claim isn't, well, that's not wrong. The claim is just, the claim is just, it's not objectification. And in fact, I mean, I'm not someone that tends to put these things in matters of degree, talking about what's worse than what, but it's clear to me, and I think you rightly highlight, that there are distinctive forms of cruelty that latch onto the fact that that someone has a certain kind of subjectivity. And I just don't think that's the lens. I don't think the lens of objectification is the right lens to think about those sorts of things. The Australian philosopher Raymond Gates has a series of essays published in book form, Our Common Humanity, in which he explores some of this a lot. And Gates' work was really influential on my dissertation and so on. And he kind of speaks eloquently to precisely this dynamic.
Yeah, I know.
In a way that I find pretty convincing.
Okay, I'm not familiar with that. I'll have to check it out. Yeah, the kind of examples that I was using, and you really highlighted them. I think Paul Bloom kind of writes about this in his work on empathy. And I think he had an op-ed in the Atlantic or the New Yorker or something about dehumanization, where a lot of the atrocities that we see aren't actually a result from dehumanizing someone. They're a result of really imbibing their humanity and hating them for it. Yeah. Yes. I find this analysis of a lot of these cases pretty compelling. So objectification is in my view bad, but it's certainly, again, going back to our themes about other lenses you might use. I don't think it's the only way that we can disrupt human relationships. In some cases, it might not be the worst way. But it is a way that I think, again, if the theme of the book is to try to highlight some of the ways in which the relationship between players and fans can go awry, this is one that I think might be missed some. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's interesting. I want to follow up on reading Nussbaum's and Papadakis' work, because they both seem interesting. So let's because we're over an hour at this point, but I want to talk about, I also had mixed feelings about the silencing question. Yeah. Because now I'm thinking about it in a different view, because I originally had the question of, is silencing really objectifying to athletes? Because there's the obvious way in which, and you've already pointed this out, you're just an athlete, you're this kind of thing almost that's supposed to entertain me. I don't care, shut up about X, whatever X is. And that seems like an obvious way in which silencing is objectifying. But then there's another way in which, and this might just be the terminological debate we've been talking about, but there's another way in which one could silence an athlete in a very reactive, kind of hateful way, right? Like where they, in the Paul Bloom sense, really kind of hate them for what they're saying as a human being, not really as an athlete.
Yeah.
I wonder if it just comes down to how they silence them.
Well, so this is, no, I mean, I think there's a difference. I don't work this out in any detail, and I don't have it worked out in any detail. Well, in much detail. I think there's a difference between silencing an athlete from speaking on anything with the stated reason that they're an athlete and it's your job to play. I think there's a difference between that, which I take as a kind of paradigm instance of objectification, and then wanting to silence athletes because they're talking about things that we don't, or because we don't like them personally, or because we think they're saying dumb things, or we think they're saying dangerous things, or they're saying things that we disagree with. And this sort of goes back to something we were talking about earlier, some tension. Well, if you think athletes have a right to speak, does that mean they have a right to speak when they're saying things that you think are wrong or false or even potentially harmful? And again, I don't have this worked out in a ton of detail. I mean, I have my own reactions to athletes when they speak out and say things that I find abhorrent. And I will find myself sometimes saying, well, you're just a effing basketball player. Like, why do we care what you have to say about this? And then I think, well, is that just because I'm not agreeing with what you say? If you were saying something that I liked, I would have a different sort of reaction. And I think the response is, like all of us, athletes have a right to speak. And I think there's a difference between responding to the content of what someone says and trying to shut down their right to speak at all. And so I think I've tried to disentangle those things, to not allow myself to say, you're just a basketball player, why do we care what you have to say about this? Because I think that's not a good reason to not listen to someone. We're all just people who have moral views that we're allowed to speak. I think if you then say, well, I think that you're wrong, and I wish that you wouldn't say this because I think it's false and dangerous and potentially hateful and harmful, that's not objectifying. That's just, and that's not even, I would suggest that's not even silencing. That's just responding to speech that we think is bad. So again, I don't have this worked out in any sort of neat and tidy way, but I do think that there's a difference between those two sorts of responses.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I was kind of torn, and maybe my conflict is because on a kind of a moral level, you're right. Everyone does have a right to express their opinion, and no one should be. I mean, certainly no one should be fired, for like, Aaron Rodgers shouldn't be fired. Well, that's a tricky question because it comes down to like harming others in a sense. But like, it would be insane to have fired, LeBron James for speaking out against, police brutality. Right. And there was he on the Celtics? There was some player who responded to him. Right. And it would be insane for the league to sanction either of them. Right. Yeah. So that's something I totally agree on. I think the weird tension that I have is maybe due to an epistemic side or an epistemic question where there is this weird obsession that fans have with, how do I want to put it? Yeah. I've noticed a phenomenon where people will give maybe epistemic undue attention to athletes' opinions on something in a way that it doesn't really seem to make any epistemic sense, right? So like if Kyrie Irving is against the vaccine, people will latch onto that opinion with I've got to think the understanding that he doesn't probably know anything about vaccines in a deep sense. Like, he certainly doesn't know more than any medical expert does.
Yeah. I mean, I think our tendency to pay, I mean, this is a double-edged sword that tends probably to track with whether we agree with what the athlete is saying. And so you put it in terms of epistemic sense. I mean, if you put it in terms of whether they have any authority, any special authority to speak out on what they're saying, in almost every case, the answer is going to be no.
Yeah.
But that's true for most people.
Yeah.
It's true for actors or musicians that speak out on these sorts of things. That's true for our crazy uncles at, Thanksgiving.
Yep.
That's true of pretty much everything. And so I'm not of the view that this isn't exactly connected, but I don't think we shouldn't objectify athletes. I also don't think we should pedestal them. And I don't engage with this in much detail in the book, but I am in the camp that thinks athletes aren't, and in fact shouldn't be role models, shouldn't be regarded as role models. They're just people like the rest of us who happen to do extraordinary things often on the field of play. And that's consistent with, them having all sorts of other foibles. And I guess again, just to go reiterate a point I've probably made too much already, I think the difference is, are you trying to silence them and deny their quote unquote right to speak because they're an athlete? Or are you responding to the content of what they have to say? And I also think it's good to police our own responses in terms of how we respond to athletes that say the things that we like and agree with. LeBron tends to say things that I agree with. Kyrie Irving does not. And so is my response to them, look, well, listen to what LeBron has to say because he has some special insight? Or is it just, well, he's saying stuff I already agree with and Kyrie's not? I think it's still fair to respond to the content of what they say in the same way that it's fair to respond to the content of what anybody says. We shouldn't silence athletes, but neither should we just let them say, free speech comes with the right to be criticized. I think just criticizing them because you're just a stupid basketball player is kind of what the reaction that I want us to avoid.
Yeah, I totally agree. It also seems like a lazy way to criticize people. There was some, I remember, the last 2 years have been so crazy. I don't even remember if this was in 2020 or 2021, but there was some. No one
knows anything anymore. Date-wise,
those 2 years of the same year in my mind.
Yeah. And anything before that, those 2 years is like this undifferentiated blob before
of normal times.
2000, about 2015.
That's true. I remember there was some damning juxtaposition on it was circulating Twitter, but I'm sure it was on YouTube and everything. I think it was Fox News hosts, and I don't remember who they juxtaposed this to, but someone literally said the words "shut up and dribble" about I think it was LeBron, right? And then
probably,
and then I there was some, and it was also bad because LeBron's obviously black, and the person they juxtaposed it to was white. There was some white actor or so, I don't remember what he was, but he said something about the protests of the lockdowns, and they were fawning over him and celebrate. Yeah. And it was just this damning juxtaposition that I thought of in reading this.
Which again, and then the reaction that you can have to what they say is perfectly fair game. I mean, you don't have to agree with what LeBron has to say, but criticizing him because he's a basketball player and telling him to just shut up and dribble is, that strikes me as objectifying.
It strikes me that way too. Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, Adam, thanks so much for doing this. I had a great time. This was a fun episode, a good read.
Ton of fun. I really appreciate the conversation.
Yeah. So I'll link to the book and your website and everything in the notes below. But is there anywhere that you want to point people to follow up on your work?
You can, if you go to my professional website, I keep that pretty well up to date. You can drop me a line there. I'm on Twitter at AJ Kadlac. I don't tweet a ton, but if you follow me, I will probably follow you back, and you can DM me there. That's perfectly fine too.
Okay, cool. All right, stay on the line, Adam, but thanks again for doing this. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'm really thankful to Adam for coming on the show. I really enjoyed our talk, and I hope you found it enlightening as well. If you want to support me and what I'm doing on this show, you can go to patreon.com/Jordan Myers. You can share the show on Twitter or social media generally. You can rate it on Apple Podcasts, like and subscribe to YouTube or your RSS feeds, and you can also connect with me. You can email me at platoscavepodcast@gmail.com, and you can follow me on Twitter at Jordan_C_Myers. And all of those links and more will be in the description below. And as always, thank you for listening, and keep struggling to escape the cave.